Welcome back, Cold War 5 listeners. I'm your host, Mike Dupre. Today's discussion is titled Peacemaking, Persuasion, and Public Diplomacy. And my guest joining me is Ambassador Mark Storella. He might be a familiar face to many of you at Boston University, but also the international relations community at large. Ambassador Storella was a United States Foreign Service officer for over 3 decades, serving as ambassador to Zambia, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugees, and Migration, and the Dean of the Leadership and Management School of the Foreign Service Institute. Other postings might include the Deputy Chief of Mission in Brussels, at the U.S. mission to the UN in Geneva and in Penh. Ambassador Storella is a recipient of the Presidential Rank Award, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Excellence in Service Award, the Thomas Jefferson Award presented by the American Citizens Abroad, and several other Department of State superior and meritorious honors as well. So Ambassador Storella was a Senior Department of State Fellow, a Dean, and the Virginia Rusk Fellow at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, and is currently the Professor of Practice of Diplomacy and the Director of the African Studies Center here at Boston University. So with that, I appreciate you coming in today, Ambassador. I know our conversation will yield some interesting answers and maybe some solutions about what our country is doing abroad and why it's important that we have that international mindset.
Mike, I'm delighted to be with you.
If we really want to jump right into what you do best, which is act as a practitioner and as a representative of the United States abroad. Many of your postings have been in countries where the United States might not consider to be great powers, in Zambia and Cambodia, but in many ways that there is great power influence in these regions, and I think that may come in a number of forms. I think Zambia, where you held your ambassadorship, and is an example of a country in a region where there's numerous external forces, and maybe in some opening remarks, if you can kind of lend why the United States should be engaging in diplomatic and more broadly democratic promotion. And why is it important for us to consider these regions and take initiative in these areas where it is incredibly difficult, but also incredibly important?
Yeah. Mike, let me start by saying that many people question why the United States would care. And this is a live question. It's a real and serious question, and it needs an answer. And I would start by saying that the United States is in a position that actually no other country has ever been in the history of the world. We've never had global politics the way we have now, and we've never actually had global powers the way we have now. You could argue that the British were at one point in that position, and certainly the Soviet Union played that kind of a role. But the United States had the unique perspective of having, after World War II, been the principal author in the development of an international system, which is sometimes called the liberal international order, in which the United States has a stake not only in particular issues or particular countries, but in maintaining the entire system, this so-called rules-based system. So the United States has sometimes been called, certainly by former Secretary of State Albright, the indispensable power. Not everyone agrees with that. But the United States also was the first country to establish what we call universal representation. We have embassies in every single country with some very minor exceptions. And the United States seems to have a position on every issue. When I was working as a diplomat, especially in a place like Geneva, where there are 50 UN agencies, I always told my staff, you need to understand that whenever you're in a room, everyone wants to hear what the United States thinks. So think carefully before you speak, and we have to have a position on the issues. So the United States has sought to have positions on almost every issue because we've tried to influence the entire system. So that's part of the background, and not everyone agrees with that. A lot of people think we shouldn't be bearing this burden right now. I always used to tell, again, my staff at various embassies that I wanted them to practice Aretha Franklin diplomacy. And what did that mean? R-E-S-P-E-C-T. Aretha Franklin's, one of her greatest songs. And what I meant was that the United States is seen around the world as a colossus. We're seen as putting our nose in almost everything. And often, frankly, that's resented. And therefore, as the United States engages around the world, it's absolutely essential that our diplomats demonstrate that they respect local peoples, local cultures, local customs, even when we have, in some cases, serious bones to pick about different kinds of issues, particularly human rights issues, for example. So the United States has set up for itself a kind of complex role, which is now being questioned in many areas. But frankly, I think the United States still has a great stake in maintaining this system that we built up, because this system has served our interests extremely well.
As a follow-up to that, this is something we talked a little bit about before the mics came on, was this idea, should the United States be supporting its interests versus the interests of peacemaking, which sometimes might clash. And more broadly, not necessarily just peacemaking, the diplomacy in general, kind of the aid in which we provide countries. In many respects, the privatization of our world order, which has pulled a lot of countries out of poverty, has also had the negative effect that some countries might perceive. I'm curious your take. Where's that balance come in as someone who has to deal with that every day?
So I always tell, in the days when I was still in the State Department, diplomats who are earlier in their career, and certainly all my students, they need to think about what the purpose of diplomacy is. And when you ask students, what's the purpose of diplomacy? They'll say, oh, to make friends, oh, to make agreements, oh, to build bridges. And I say, no. It's to serve the interests of the American people. That's the only thing you should be doing as an American diplomat. Now, that may sound very narrow-minded, and it might sound very selfish. But what I think is the real secret of American diplomacy, and what has made us stand out as a great power and made us different from other powers in the world, is that we have so often taken an enlightened view of our self-interest. The United States has typically felt that the American people will be safer when our allies are secure, that the American people will have greater prosperity when we have trading partners who are also becoming rich. And we have also felt, and this is a highly contested issue, that our freedoms are best protected when democracy and human rights are on the march around the world. That's why I think the United States has an interest in so many different areas where our interests are not narrow, but are very broad.
And that lends itself to this greater idea of what's the actual capacity of the United States in meeting those ambitions today versus what you might have experienced in your 30 years. You spent a career kind of negotiating such promotions, aiding democratic transitions, particularly in Africa and whatnot. But yet you've also spoken to the limits of this. And I know your views are kind of best described in this TEDx talk over at Tufts that you did last year. You talk about what diplomats can do and should do in protecting people fighting for their rights. And the theme of the discussion, for those who haven't seen it, is essentially your relationship with this Cambodian opposition leader who's forced to flee the country due to what seems like almost a guaranteed execution. You spend a lot of time at the table, the Khmer Rouge and their opposition and the international community, hoping to kind of protect those human rights and more broadly let Cambodia kind of rebuild their democracy on their own. But despite going to the bed to the sound of gunfire, you've described this as one of the more exciting projects that you've been a part of. The Cambodian people are, of course, still fighting for that freedom. So I'm curious what your stance is on the United States abroad, these grandiose aspirations for democracy. Does it yield a sense of hope for you still, now that you've seen the more pragmatic view in academia as well?
Mike, those Cambodia peace talks are a really great example and are still pertinent today. You have to look back at the time. And the United States was coming out of the Vietnam War. We had had our first defeat on the battlefield, and we had had an ignominious helicopter-supported evacuation of our forces and our people from Saigon, reminiscent of what just happened in Kabul. Many people said, enough. We don't have an interest there anymore. But the people I was working with at the State Department said, there's still a conflict going on. The conflict's principally between Vietnam, supported by, at that time, the Soviet Union, and the Cambodian factions, supported by the British, the French, the Chinese, and the United States. And this war had been going on for 17 years, a 17-year civil war. Why should we stick our nose in that? And how should we stick our nose in that? Well, to me, the answer was that the United States had to re-engage in Southeast Asia. And as long as we had the legacy of the Vietnam War unsolved, issues like POWs and MIAs that we were still wondering about what their fate was, the American people were not going to want to re-engage. And we were not going to be able to re-engage until we settled this conflict that was a civil war. So I was involved in 2 years of negotiations and then 3 years of implementing the peace plan. But the peace plan actually called for not only a cessation of hostilities, but settling differences through democratic elections. That fight has not ended. Cambodia is not a free country today. The prime minister in 1985 is the prime minister today, Hun Sen. And he stayed there in part because many of his opponents have disappeared from the scene, some of them through imprisonment, some of them through intimidation, and some of them have died along the way. I was engaged in the story that you mentioned in trying to help protect the leader of the opposition so that he could continue to contest politics through elections. And in fact, he was able to. And the idea didn't end, even though I would say Cambodia is still an authoritarian country. But what does it mean for the American people? What it means for the American people is that now the United States was able to repair its relations with Vietnam. We now have ship visits at ports that we once fled from as the war collapsed around us. Vietnam is now one of our strongest partners, a kind of silent strategic partner in what has become a global competition with China. And the United States still is able to defend and keep open the waterways that permit trillions of dollars of goods to pass around the world, which supports the prosperity of the American people. So in fact, our interests were way beyond the simple question of which Cambodian faction was going to end up on top in Phnom Penh. Those interests had to do with America's place in the world and our ability to defend our interests, our freedom, and the security of our own people and our allies in the Pacific.
This is a very applicable situation to democracy's slow process abroad. You've talked a lot about the American interest there, but the interest also for the Cambodian people. I think maybe, and I guess I'm guilty of this at times too, we think of democracy as this fix-all to everyone's problems. And in many ways, we're aiding these democratic transitions that are naturally going to take a long time. And I think we're given, 250 years of hindsight here, more if you count the parliamentary government that we came from. But do you think the American people have a pessimistic outlook because democracy isn't happening at the rate at which we would like it to happen in some countries? And if so, can you provide any, maybe some reassurances that what we're doing to promote democracy abroad is important and worth the long-term investment that it might have?
I think that the American people are justifiably frustrated. The United States has made tremendous efforts around the world to support democracies in countries where it hasn't taken root necessarily. And Americans, I think, are particularly disappointed with efforts where we have used military forces and put American citizens' lives on the line in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, where our efforts have ultimately come up far short of what we were hoping we could achieve. What I would say about that is, first, democracy is not a simple thing. People often think democracy is an election. An election is only one piece of a democracy. A democracy is made up of the rules that lead to an election, the habits of political parties to contest an election, the training of poll workers to actually watch an election, the development of laws to conduct the election, the building up of an understanding amongst the people of what they are voting for in an election, the ability of the media to present views openly. This is an extremely complicated process. And you know the famous Churchillian line, although it's not really clear that he said this, but that democracy is the worst form of government except all the others. I would say it's also one of the hardest forms of government, and it's still an experiment. Our democracy in the United States remains an experiment. And you don't have to look back far to know that even our democracy is tested. So what I would say about that is the American people, I think, who are skeptical about this, have some good reasons to be skeptical. And we have to recognize that we are not going to be able to enforce democracy or implement democracy on our own. This is going to be an organic process. It's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and maybe 1 step forward, 2 steps back in some countries. But then the question really is it really even our business? And you probably are familiar with the statement made before the United States Congress by then Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, where he said, wherever the banner of freedom is unfurled, there will be America's heart. But we go not abroad to conquer monsters. We are the friend of liberty everywhere, but the protector of only our own. Many Americans are saying, why don't we return to that? Wouldn't that be the right thing for us to do? But I would say that was 1823 or something like that. It was a long time ago when John Quincy Adams, who incidentally is from right around here in Boston, in Quincy, in fact, when he spoke those words, and the United States was a small power which was not in a position to engage the world. That's very different. We now really do have interests all over the world. So does the United States care what goes on in Zambia? Why would we care about what goes on in Zambia? Well, one thing I'll tell you is that Zambia is the second biggest producer of copper in all of Africa and one of the biggest producers of copper in the world. If we're going to be able to manufacture things, we need to have some access to that. And what's more, we have to ensure that no other country, guess who's big there, China, locks it up. You also have to wonder, well, what will happen in situations where we have a general breakdown in order? That's not the case in Zambia, but we're seeing that happening in Sudan right now. And when that happens, people are on the move. Migration's a big issue. It's only going to get bigger. And if the United States can't help support stability in countries around the world, we may find huge movements of people under the pressure of conflict, fear, or deprivation, and they may end up on our doorstep. There are people at the southern border of the United States now who are not from the northern triangle of Central America, but who are coming from Africa and Afghanistan and even Ukraine. So the world is very interconnected, and it means that, to me, the United States has to have an enlightened view of its self-interests, and we have to recognize that our interests are in many different places. It's a hard sell, though, and I think that we have to keep explaining why we're pursuing these policies, and we have to critically judge ourselves whether or not we're doing the right thing. Is it always worth the effort for the American people? Are we really identifying the interests of the American people correctly? And that's a tremendous challenge. We'll talk about that more, I'm sure.
Certainly. Mike Singh, who's over at the U.S. Institute of Peace now, has this interesting analogy that he uses between authoritarianism and democracy. He says it's a kayak reference, that authoritarianism is like a flat-bottom kayak on the ocean. It's initially stable. It seems great, but as soon as you start to tip, there's no way to flip it back over, whereas democracy is like an angled body kayak where it's unstable at first, and suddenly it's incredibly difficult to actually flip it over once you kind of get in it and get settled.
Well, Mike, what I would say about that, and I've said this in many countries where I've served around the world, democracies are self-correcting. Autocracies don't correct until you get rid of the leader who's making all the mistakes. And I mean, you can look at this right now. I think a great example is China. China was led for a long time by Mao Zedong when the Chinese Communist Party took over in 1949. His policies were catastrophic for the Chinese people. We don't know how many, but it's between 20 and 50 million Chinese died in the Great Leap Forward. Many Americans don't even know about that. But in fact, this was the largest killing or responsibility for deaths of innocent people in the history of the world, and it happened under one leader, and he wasn't done yet. When he was finished with that, he then went on to impose the Cultural Revolution, destroying tremendous artifacts of culture, but also completely upending China and its development. The country, people always say, wow, it's amazing. China's developed so quickly. Well, I ask you, why did it develop so slowly? And the answer is, in part, that they had autocratic governments with terrible rulers they could not get rid of.
I love that ending there, the terrible rulers. That you personally have to deal with a lot of foreign leaders and rulers and very different cultural and political contexts.
And I've dealt with a few terrible rulers.
Certainly, I imagine so. Robert Jackson has this piece in the Global Covenant where he lays out the, as we talked about before, kind of the differences from viewing statecraft as a statesman versus as an academic or a theorist. And he calls it the situational ethics of statecrafts. And he gives a lot of credence to diplomats who essentially live as a representative to a larger entity. Can you maybe provide some examples in your career where you've had to deal with people that, personally you might not agree with very much on, and how you manage those diplomatic talks, if you will,
sure,
and how you get the deal done despite
sure.
no agreement?
So, what do you know about the Khmer Rouge?
I can tell you they're not looked well upon in the West, and certainly not by the Cambodian.
They're hated, and there's a good reason why they're hated. A new term was coined because of the Khmer Rouge, auto-genocide, when leaders of a country end up killing their entire country. They're responsible for the deaths of over 20% of their entire population. But when it came time to negotiate this peace treaty, we decided we could not put them aside, because if they were not included, they would keep fighting. So I had, amongst my many crazy jobs over the years, in 1989, I walked next to our Secretary of State at the time, and at the Paris peace talks in Cambodia. And Jim Baker wanted to be at the peace talks. He wanted to participate in this, but we knew that if there was a photograph of him shaking hands with the Khmer Rouge, we'd be in big trouble, that this was not going to go over well. And so my job, as I walked next to him, I had photographs of all the members of the Khmer Rouge delegation on my arm, glued there. And whenever we met a Cambodian, he'd look at me and I'd either nod my head, yes, you can shake hands, or no, don't shake hands with this person.
Wow.
So we were negotiating with them, but we wouldn't even shake hands with them. And when we finally finished the peace agreement, I mean, remarkable things happened. The peace agreement called for the Khmer Rouge to come back to Phnom Penh and set up an office there and participate in the elections and disarm and all the rest. And my job as a relatively junior officer was to visit the Khmer Rouge at their offices and talk with them about the implementation of the agreement. And I was very upset by this. I was very polite with them. We spoke French together. They were frequently very well-educated people, which always astonished me, but there it is. And I remember one day walking out of their offices and feeling like, what am I doing? And I turned to one of my friends with whom I had gone to graduate school, and we were both stationed in Cambodia together. And I asked him, his name was Mike too. Mike, what do you think about shaking hands with the Khmer Rouge? And he said, well, honestly, I don't mind extending my right hand to shake their hand if it leaves my left hand free to stab them in the back. I mean, that's a rather crazy way to put it, I suppose. But in fact, we were setting terms not to kill anyone, not to stab anyone, not to assassinate anyone, but to create conditions in which the Cambodian people would decide if they wanted the Khmer Rouge to be their leaders. Guess what? They lost the elections terribly, and they've never been a political force in Cambodia ever since. It was a very successful effort, and it required us dealing with people who were absolutely reprehensible. But we did. I've had other cases like that. I love to tell my students to try to amaze them. See this hand? It is twice shaken the hand of Kim Jong-il. So I've traveled with Madeleine Albright to North Korea, to Pyongyang, and met with the father of the current leader. His name was Kim Jong-il, not Kim Jong-un, and certainly not Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current leader. And I saw Madeleine Albright engage with this person who had carried out policies that probably resulted in famine and the deaths of 2 million of his own people. Why did we do that? Because we wanted to constrain their nuclear program and their missile program so they could not strike our allies or our own homeland with nuclear weapons. It was worth doing. And we treated them, frankly, very politely, and they treated us very politely. The sad thing is that negotiation came very close to fruition, but then there was a change of government in the United States, being a democracy, and the George W. Bush administration decided to discontinue the negotiations. I look back on that and I say, well, there is no doubt those folks were part of the axis of evil, as George W. Bush stated it. But when they did not have nuclear weapons and they did not have intercontinental ballistic missiles, and today they do. We should have continued those negotiations, I think.
I think both points hold significant relevance. I don't think the killing fields of Cambodia are coming back like you mentioned in your talk, but there remains a legacy there, and there certainly remains a legacy now in North Korea. So your colleague, and I guess also the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, says that in order to be a successful negotiator as a diplomat, you have to be able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand what motivates them. And you're never going to be able to figure out how to solve the problem if you can't do that. And as you've mentioned, that there's certainly some people that you would probably prefer not to step in their shoes. I guess what tactics does the United States employ at large, and maybe what tactics have you employed to negotiate with our allies who are on the same footing as us but have different interests, but also our adversaries who certainly have different interests and maybe different perspectives than we might.
Yeah. So I was on the NATO desk for 2 years, and I've worked in Belgium and Rome and Paris and Geneva. And so I've worked a lot on alliance security issues over the years. The way I was raised as a diplomat, and I use the word raised because I think of myself as having been a child diplomat once upon a time, was that our alliances are sacred. And we must treat them that way, and we must treat our allies that way. Because honestly, our concept with especially the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is we have to have a strong defense there. Because if we don't, eventually we're going to be drawn in. And who knows, we could even be attacked here. And so what I always used to tell people is the first thing you do whenever there's a problem is you negotiate with the allies and consult with them. And then when you finish consulting with them, consult again. And then when you're done with that, consult again. When you're dealing with close allies, you have the advantage of being able to create a dense web of relations, which means you have a dense web of understanding and trust. Once you have those things, you can do amazing things together. When you don't have those things in diplomacy, you can't do almost anything. And that's the challenge that we face with countries like Russia and China right now. Trust is terribly eroded. And it's going to be very hard to build it up to get to the point where we're going to be able to negotiate. But we can. And it takes courage. It takes someone, usually at a political level, taking the risk to step forward. The great example, again, was China, where Richard Nixon, a commie hater all his life, somehow was able to actually travel to China to meet with Mao Zedong at the height of the Cultural Revolution and create an entente between the United States and China that ultimately contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So not easy to do. It's a big risk. But I would say you always have to work first with your allies to keep that dense network of relationships that create understanding and trust. And then periodically you have to have courage. And that courage has to be obviously well thought through. The objective is not to be risky with your own country's security, but the courage to take the step to build some level of trust when trust is so terribly eroded.
Our allies change over time, their interests change. Our interests, I think, sometimes change. But I think there's a couple components of our diplomacy that always are consistent, which is the fact that culture is ever present, and so is politics is also omnipresent. But a relatively new phenomenon might be, and this is maybe a little bit of a segue into a new conversation, the relatively new emergence of social media and the availability of information of people outside the diplomatic sphere, where people are now more informed than ever and have this surplus of information to lean on and when they're dealing with business, trade, culture. And do you think that the public's access to that, but also diplomats' access to that, is maybe helping or hindering that promotion of American interests abroad, but also human rights at large abroad?
That's a very difficult question because I think we're still in play right now on this. Things are evolving rather quickly. And diplomats are slow to adapt, I think, to social media and the development of technologies. I was really bad at it myself, to be honest, and I relied on my staff. And typically I'd go try to find who's the youngest person in the embassy because they probably know how to do this. But I'll give you an example of how these things can work in a positive way and trying to do so in a local, culturally sensitive way. When we were in Zambia and I was ambassador there, we had a whole series of things we were trying to achieve. One of the things we were trying to achieve had to do with empowerment of girls and women. Those issues are important on many different levels. They're important for human rights. They're important for violence in society and minimizing violence in society because women are often, sadly, subject to gender-based violence. But it also has a lot to do with economic development and health and education. So how are we going to reach all these girls? And honestly, you could just guess, they weren't that interested in the tweets by the U.S. ambassador. So I didn't know what to do. And one of our public affairs officers, Priscilla Hernandez, I hope she doesn't mind me using her name, had a great idea. She said, look, they're not going to listen to you. But you know what? They really like TV personalities and they like musicians. So she said, why don't we start sponsoring trips where you'll travel someplace to talk about girls' empowerment, women's rights, health for women. And we'll bring along what she called pop icons.
Oh, no.
And then the pop icons, we won't even try to influence what they do. Just let them tweet. It was amazing because they were tweeting about what we were doing. Oh, we went to this clinic where they're working on HIV prevention, and the ambassador said such and such. I could never have reached the demographic they were reaching, but they were willing to do it and they were interested. And what's more, we got some free music out of it. And I have to tell you, these folks were very entertaining. So it was a terrific time. We had a great time, and we were able to reach people with messages that otherwise we would not have been able to.
The contradiction to that's a very pertinent issue right now is maybe the misinformation that people are able to throw out as well as the information. How are diplomats kind of operating and dissecting that? I know intelligence is playing a very big role in OSINT right now with making sure that the available information is accurate and credible, but diplomats obviously have to deal with real-time changes as well. I'm curious if you can lend some interest into that.
It's a good question. People sometimes say that in the current media environment, why do we even have embassies? Why don't we just buy a subscription to The Economist and fire the whole embassy staff? We could save a lot of money. The answer, from my mind, well, there are many reasons. One is that you have to build up relationships, and you can't build up relationships by subscribing to The Economist. But the other is that we don't actually lack information. Our problem is that we have a superfluity of information now. And you need people who are in a position to interpret that information and strain it and determine this is the important piece of information in the midst of this cloud of ideas that you can find on the internet. And diplomats who are in place, who understand the local circumstances, are the ones who can do that. I'm going to just tell a little story which kind of amazed me. When I was in Zambia, we were very fortunate. We had a visit of the Secretary of State at that time, Hillary Rodham Clinton. She came for 3 days, first visit of a Secretary of State to Zambia in 35 years. The last one was Henry Kissinger. And so obviously we were very excited about this. And Secretary of State travels with a huge entourage, as you would think. And I thought, I'm the ambassador here. I'm supposed to know everything about this place. And I have no idea if I'll ever even speak with her. I have no idea how this is going to go. And the very first day she arrived, and we all went up to her suite at the hotel, and we were going to have a dinner with the president of Zambia that night. And she brought the whole group together. She said, okay, so we're preparing for this dinner with the president. Let me ask the ambassador, set the scene, tell me what's important to him. And I thought, wow. She wants to use her diplomats. And she has a whole group of people with her who are very well informed, but she wants to use the people who are on the ground. So I think you still need those interpreters. And diplomats frequently are interpreters of local scenes, of the interests of local people for their home governments. And even in the era of social media, the internet, a superfluity of information, you need somebody who can pick through the information to tell you what is the important thing.
And I'm interested too in this thing that transcends not only the State Department but also just the government in general, is the expansion and constriction of hiring throughout the course of time and within different administrations. The Clinton administration, of course, expanded the size of the State Department quite rapidly too, whereas the Bush administration.
So sadly, we suffer in government from the same thing that people suffer from when they're graduating from college. There are periods when we're hiring, and there are periods when we're not. Mm-hmm. And if your timing's right, you get a chance to get in. If your timing's not, you wait.
Yeah. So I'm curious, I guess, off that point, where the State Department currently stands now, do you think that they would benefit from a larger, being a large entity, a larger bureaucracy, or do you think it's in its current form it needs to shrink? I'm curious on what your thoughts are on that.
There is a theory out there that diplomacy is dead, that we can't negotiate anything anymore, that things have just become too complex, that with the end of America as the sole superpower, the hyperpower, as the French called us, that diplomacy is just not going to work. I have exactly the opposite conclusion. My view is that we are now in a period where diplomacy has become more complex. There are more players on the field. We actually have to engage in a more sophisticated way. I think we need diplomacy more than ever, and we're going to need diplomats more than ever. So actually, I think we need to hire more people. if you ask me. Now, the State Department may seem really big, but there are only about 8,500 Foreign Service officers in the world. You know, everyone's heard it, that the Department of Defense has more members of military bands than we have diplomats. Now, probably most Americans appreciate a military band more than they like to listen to a diplomat. I can say that with assurance. But we can recognize this is not a big investment compared to other things we're doing around the world. It's actually relatively cheap, and I think it's really needed.
But you've also been a very strong advocate for health diplomacy abroad, as you've mentioned with the combating AIDS in Africa. I think a very important question, one that has received a lot of airtime recently, but maybe more so from pundits than practitioners. You've mobilized large-scale operations of aid abroad. In a Hill op-ed, you say that the U.S. makes unique contributions through our leading technical institutions, and you continue by saying that American health diplomacy serves the broader American interests. I think this is a very important identification, but I want to hear your thoughts and maybe your expanded thoughts on that as well, on the convergence of aid and interest.
Mm-hmm. We have to think carefully about that. When I was administering various kinds of aid programs, I felt a great responsibility to make sure that we weren't wasting the money. And when I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration, the folks that I was working with were managing a $2 billion portfolio. That's a lot of money. And it was for refugees around the world. We made every single person in the Bureau go through courses, training on monitoring and evaluation. How do you know that whatever it is you're doing is actually having an effect? And that's really important. Sometimes aid is performative. People do things to say we did things rather than to actually achieve something. And so I think we have to look at all those programs very, very carefully. But health is one of the great examples where our investments are a bargain. A bargain. Now, why do I say that? We've spent a lot of money on PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief. That was an initiative by George W. Bush, and he launched it in 2003 in a State of the Union address. And the United States has now spent $110 billion, most of it in Africa, to combat AIDS. And people ask me, what are we getting for it? Well, one thing is, we don't ask anything for it. We do not set conditions because we see this in many respects as a humanitarian operation. We're trying to save lives. But we're also trying to stop communities and nations from dissolving into chaos. It's hard for Americans to recognize this now, but HIV was spreading so fast in Africa. It was decimating especially the educated populations, and there was beginning to be a problem of maintaining government and order in many of these countries. Our efforts to stem the tide of HIV have saved millions of lives. That alone is worth doing, and the American people, I think, are very proud of doing that. But we also have kept Southern Africa from dissolving into chaos, which would have had ramifications in many different ways. So health is a really good example. Now we look at what's happened with COVID. I spent a lot of time working on this, and I happened to be our chargé in Geneva during the time of the swine flu epidemic in 2009. And I don't know if people remember that one, but people were very afraid that that was going to be the big one, that this was going to be the pandemic that was going to wipe everybody out. And it actually started on the U.S.-Mexico border somewhere. We still don't know where exactly. When that happened, the United States immediately dispatched Kathleen Sebelius, who was then the Secretary of Health and Human Services, to Geneva. And I brought her to meet with Margaret Chan, who was the Director General of the World Health Organization at the time, in the SHOC room, which I think stands for, what is it, Secure Health Operations Center, something like that. It's a great name, the SHOC room.
Seriously.
And there they planned the response, the global response. Actually, in that case, we were able to tamp down the swine flu. It never became a very threatening disease. In the case of COVID, there is no good time for a pandemic, but this pandemic hit at a really bad time. It hit at a time of vastly reduced trust between the United States and China, and at a time when the United States was leaning in a fairly isolationist direction under the leadership of President Donald Trump. The United States withdrew from the World Health Organization, or we tried to withdraw. We actually were unable to because we had to give a year's notice. So we indicated that we were going to withdraw, but we started disengaging and we started pulling back our money. That's not all we did. We pulled back our experts from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, from the Food and Drug Administration, that we had stationed in China, working with Chinese authorities to help them establish their own CDC. We blinded ourselves. And we blinded ourselves just at the moment when a pandemic hit. And I think that the United States and China probably could have been much more effective in cooperating together. And please believe me, I fault the Chinese for having made their own mistakes in all of this and having not told the truth about what was going on at a very early stage, and still trying to block efforts to figure out how this thing started. So there are lots of problems on the Chinese side on this. But if the United States had been fully engaged with China at that time, maybe we would have not only had the ability to speak with them, maybe we would have had scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Maybe we would have had our own CDC doctors in the Centers for Disease Control of China. We would have known what was going on. You know, a lot has been said about the fact that American diplomats visited the Wuhan Institute of Virology. When I was still in government, I actually called the people who did that and said, well, what was it like? And they said, oh, we were honored guests. They put us up on their website. And it was only when COVID hit that they took it down. We had a relationship we could have built on that had trust and understanding. And that trust and understanding was so badly eroded. What were the costs for the United States of this? Now, I can't tell you that had we been able to cooperate better with China, that we could have stopped the thing at an early stage. I'm not sure we could have. But we could have done much better. We've lost 1,100,000 Americans. We've probably lost $1 trillion, more than that, of economic output in the United States, probably $2 or $3 trillion worth of economic output in the United States. We had an interest in developing a surveillance system and cooperation so that we would know very early, at the very moment of the outbreak, that it was happening. But we didn't have it when we needed it.
Do you think, and I don't want to stretch that, I don't want to put you in a prescriptive position here, but do you think that the potential for some sort of U.S.-China coalition on global health is something that's possible under this administration? And I guess if so, do you think it would benefit the relationship at large, or do you think it would stay isolated to global health?
Well, I mean, you've heard of vaccine diplomacy and vaccine nationalism, and very sadly, global health has now become a field of competition and even conflict between great powers. So we have a lot to repair from where we are. When I was in Zambia, going all the way back to, I think it was about 2011, I met with my Chinese counterpart, the Chinese ambassador, and I said to him, and I wonder if he would ever remember this now, I said, you know, if we can find a way to cooperate together, the United States and China, here in Zambia, it could be that what we do together will be more important than anything we do separately here. And I proposed that the United States and China find a way to cooperate on health programs in Zambia. Typically, we were providing training, we were providing all sorts of antiretroviral drugs against HIV, and they were typically building hospitals. And I have to say, not that many of them, and not at great expense, and not very good ones either. But typically that's what they were doing. And I thought, maybe I can get this guy to work with me, and we can do something together. The Chinese foreign ministry or the government in Beijing put the kibosh on it. And he said, no, I can't do anything at all. And since then, I realized that in some respects I approached this the wrong way, because a Chinese ambassador is not going to be able to make that kind of decision on the ground. We were given enough room to maneuver where I actually could have done something like that. We, on our own, but not the Chinese. So we needed to approach them in Beijing, not in Lusaka. Right now, I think we have to look for areas where we might be able to cooperate. And there are areas where we have cooperated in the past. I'll give you an example. When there was the outbreak in Liberia and where was it? Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone of Ebola, the United States and China actually were able to work together to help contain that. It wasn't a lot, and a lot depended on our ambassador at the time, Debbie Malik, who was working in Liberia, who did a great job. But it was possible. Now it's not so possible. We actually worked together to help African countries and the African Union put together Africa, the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which is located in Addis Ababa. There are lots of conflicts over that cooperation. Basically, we provided all the software, we did all the training, they built the building, and allegedly the building is full of bugs. But in any event, we were able to cooperate. I recently suggested in an article that the United States and China should try to find a way to cooperate on a program on health in Africa as a kind of entry point for health cooperation again. And there are good opportunities to do that. They're trying to put together a kind of African version of the FDA. And the United States and China actually have compatible skills and resources where we could conceivably work together to help the African Union on that, which is an opening point, perhaps. So I think we need to keep looking. We need to be creative. But right now, I suspect there's not that much stomach in either Washington or Beijing for those kinds of initiatives.
The National Defense University actually characterizes aid as this moral imperative of the United States, but it extends it and it basically says peace is also a moral imperative, and that we should inherently be going toward, or at least attempting in our role abroad, to promote peaceful relations with our allies and maintain that, but also with our adversaries. The United States, at least for the last century, has taken a mediated approach to the Middle East. Maybe given your time in Africa, I guess the issues that are currently going on in Khartoum, do you see the United States taking a similar approach to the UAE? I know that ceasefire really only lasted about 30 minutes, but the United States being this bigger player, do they have a role to play by themselves, or do you think our greatest potential in diplomatic negotiations in Africa actually might come through international organizations or collaborations, like you've mentioned? Bit of a loaded question, I know. I'm sorry.
Well, it's a big question. It's hard to answer it. It used to be that the United States was always the essential country in the room to negotiate some kind of a peace treaty. We recently saw this agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which actually was mediated by China. An extraordinary turn of events. China has never played that role in the Middle East before. And I have to say that they did that on the work that the United States had done over a couple of years, actually, to build the foundation for that agreement. And then the Chinese were able to sweep in and conclude the agreement, putting us a little bit out in the cold on that. So I think that we're in a competitive environment right now. And this is another one of the reasons that I think the United States has to be fully engaged diplomatically, because we have to be prepared to use whatever tool might be appropriate to reach the kind of agreements that you might be able to reach. So what does that mean? Well, let's take a look at what's gone on in one of the hottest conflicts going on in the world today, and a terrible tragedy, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We saw that invasion disrupted the supply chain of food to the world in a way that there was not only a spike in prices, including in the United States, but actual threat of famine around the world. And ultimately, the Black Sea Grain Initiative was negotiated with the work of Turkey, a NATO ally, albeit a NATO ally with special relations with Russia and with Moscow, and Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, but also the work of the World Food Program and some other agencies of the United Nations system. So what you see is that you can draw them in different ways. That's not the only case that we're thinking about. Look at what's going on at the biggest nuclear power plant in all of Europe, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is in danger, according to Rafael Grossi, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. There's a threat of actual release of nuclear material and radiation that could threaten all of Europe. So how are we dealing with it? Well, one way we're dealing with it is by using international organizations to try to mediate some kind of solution. And that's why the IAEA is there. And that's why Rafael Grossi is visiting The United States can't do it easily itself, but we can use an international organization or support the work of an international organization to create some kind of an agreement that can sustain peace in the immediate vicinity of that nuclear power plant, but really protect all of Europe from a potential spill of radiation.
We've taken this international perspective, but one of the things that's interesting about this podcast, I think, is when we talk about America's role abroad, and you've recently moderated a discussion with the Grassroots Summit Principles First, which has a number of notable partnerships, some very high-level government officials, ex-government officials, such as yourself as well, and they really try to hearken into the principles that anchor our politics and our core values in a time in which we might think of as more divisive in the United States. So, in closing, if our government is one with limited enumerated powers, but where the United States' role abroad, as you've mentioned, is important, what of our values are worth projecting?
I'm very attached to our values. I got my start in this whole business because of my attachment to our values.
I would agree.
I joined the Foreign Service at the height of the Cold War, and I felt like I was signing up for the duration. And what I learned was that the fight for freedom around the world and the fight to protect the freedom of our own people wasn't going to be over simply with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It turns out that there are many threats out there, and that the fight for democracy and for freedom is, to me, a permanent one. I think people often say, well, the United States shows up and they lecture us, and we don't want to be lectured about our human rights record. We don't want to be lectured about our democratic principles. The United States, I think, again, has to practice Aretha Franklin diplomacy and be respectful of others and recognize our own shortcomings as we try to promote democracy and human rights around the world. But whether there is some special elixir or formula or secret sauce, I don't know. But as often said, democracies don't fight democracies. Actually, I can't think of good examples of democracies that have gone to war with democracies. There is such a thing as a community of values that can be developed. And in the end, this concept that the United States has, that's in our founding documents, that are often referred to as these truths that we hold self-evident, these truths are ultimately not about the United States. They're not about one religion or one race or people who speak one language. And as you know, the United States, even in those days, really wasn't one of any of those things. It's really fundamentally about supporting human dignity. Wherever you go around the world, even if you ruffle feathers in talking about human rights, people will appreciate that the United States was supporting the dignity of their own people and the rights of their own people. And you know what else they appreciate? They appreciate when you save the lives of their people, and especially when you save the lives of their children. Humans are fundamentally the same all over the world. And I think that our values are not American values. I truly believe they're human values.
Awesome. I think that's a great end to our conversation. Thank you, Ambassador, for your time. I really appreciate you coming in and being a part of this project.
Mike, it's been a pleasure, and I look forward to staying in touch.
Baby, you give me ice and fire. You're giving me wind and rain. You're some kind of